Please introduce yourself and briefly summarize your education and professional background.
First, thank you so much, Todd, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it and am very appreciative of the opportunity to highlight water, which is an important resource or the most critical resource on our planet. I feel like we don't get to talk about it enough. So I'm always really thankful for the opportunity to highlight water and water innovation in particular. As far as myself and my background, my name is Sivan Zamir. I'm the Vice President of Innovation and Venture at Xylem, which is a global water technology and solutions provider that's headquartered in Washington, D.C. By way of background, I initially started my career in civil engineering. I have an undergrad and grad degree in civil engineering from UC Berkeley and Stanford, and went on to get my professional engineering license. Early career was focused on construction management with large infrastructure projects across the United States and took that show on the road, moved out to Israel for personal reasons, and was on the founding team of two startup companies, digital startup companies, specifically with water and wastewater as beachhead markets. So I was a startup founder for a number of years, and then about 4 years ago joined Xylem to lead up their innovation and venture practice about how do you get good at working with startups in the innovation ecosystem to help scale up those new technologies to market.
How would you describe how Xylem fits in the overall infrastructure industry, which is, the name of our magazine and most of our audience and readers?
Absolutely. So what I think is interesting when you talk about water, a lot of folks don't see it. They don't think about where it comes from, which makes a lot of sense because your pipes, your pumps, a good majority of your water infrastructure is quite literally buried underground. And so it's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And meanwhile, water is essential and a core part of not only to life as we know it, but to every single industrial process that is out there. Water is part and parcel to municipalities, to agriculture, to developing and generating food and beverage, semiconductor chips. It's a part of every single thing that we do. And so what I like to tell folks when you think about water, water is not the technology. It is either an end market or it is a critical resource in an end market, and it requires every single type of technology to be applied to it. So things like mechanical, your pipes, your pumps, your valves, all the way through treatment, biological and chemical treatment, up through analytical instrumentation, electronics, and all the way up through software and sophisticated cybersecurity and artificial intelligence implementation. So there's this whole array in the world of, engineering and technology that gets applied to the water sector and then to all of the industrials that we serve and work with.
So I'm pretty familiar with Xylem and what it does for the industry, but not so much of the innovation labs and the venture part. Can you elaborate a little bit more on those specifics?
Xylem Innovation Labs is the team that I lead, and it is our corporate innovation and venture group, which is essentially we have a large number of engineers and research and development teams in-house at Xylem. But in addition to that, we also need to make sure that we are connecting with the outside world and that we're acting as a channel to market and a collaboration partner for innovators globally that can help them scale their solutions and make the impact that they're intended to make in the market. And so what Xylem Innovation Labs does is work hand in hand with the rest of the Xylem business to understand where are our opportunities to develop things in-house and where do we really have good opportunities to develop things externally. And what we do is work together. It's a global team. We've got folks all the way from California and Oregon to the East Coast of New York to England to India. So it's really a global remit. And we work hand in hand with all of our businesses to scout and look at what are the most exciting startups that are out there, what's happening on the university research front, how can we partner with venture capital firms, and how do we bring that technology in Xylem's scale and reach to help scale it, and then also benefit from the innovativeness and the entrepreneurship of those partners.
What are some of the kind of the interesting and fun aspects of that kind of venture differences that you enjoy?
What I think is interesting about working in the space of venture capital in this world is that when you do venture capital from the perspective of a large corporation, the considerations are really different than traditional venture capital. If folks that are listening in are familiar with venture capital or VC investing, typically when you make an investment, you're looking at what are the financial returns of that particular technology, how's that going to add to your portfolio, how do you diversify your risk, how do you serve your investors. It's very financially motivated for the most part. when you're thinking from a corporate perspective, we're looking at venture capital as a tool in the toolkit in order to strategically align ourselves with technologies that we believe are going to scale to market and make a significant impact for our customers and communities. So we're using it as a mechanism to partner to strategically make impact and strengthen our partnerships with different companies. So it's the same tool, but a different mechanism and a different end goal.
So based on your experience, what might be some positives or negatives that make you think that a company is worth adding or maybe would turn you off from such a deal?
It's a good question. In the world of experiences that we've had with startup companies over the last several years, I would say that by and large, when we're looking at a new technology or a new company, the technology working is more or less a foregone conclusion. Of course, we're still going to test it and validate the claims and everything else. But what we're really looking at is what is the broader commercial opportunity and how can we create a 1+1 = 3 opportunity through this partnership. And we're also evaluating the team because at the end of the day, technology is great, but the people who actually do the technology development and the technology commercialization are people. And if you can't partner well together, then you're not going to be able to scale that technology well together. So evaluating that the teams are going to be able to work together is a critical part that I think a lot of folks may not quite think about. And so by putting them through this partnerships program through the Xylem Innovation Labs team that we've put together, it enables this really structured way, but also driving a more or less short cadence within the course of a year. We work with potential startup companies and we get to a yes or a no within that time frame, and then figure out how we are or are not going to work together.
So I guess to further paint the picture, could you describe maybe a recent example of either a partnership that worked and maybe some of the specifics and how that went down, or maybe one that didn't work and why, just to fill out the picture?
Yeah, I think that giving examples is always a good thing to do. So a successful example in 2022, we had a German-based company called EOMAP that went through our very first partnerships accelerator program. EOMAP is based in Germany, as I mentioned, and they've been around for about 10 years. And what they do is they leverage satellite data. They do what's called satellite remote sensing, and they leverage satellite data to look at entire watersheds to understand the water quality of large bodies of water, whether it's oceans or off, coastal environmental environments or reservoirs, as an example. And so instead of having these in situ sensors, you have this broader, higher level view of water quality. So they work hand in hand with research institutions, with coastal environmental groups, with utilities. And so what we did is we ended up partnering with them, and we now have a formal partnership. You can look it up online. It's EO App, and they're partnering hand in hand with our Xylem Analytics business. And where that works really well together is that the satellite remote sensing is a software platform that allows looking at these broader watershed or broader ecosystems. And then we can add as an additional layer Xylem's in situ, very high fidelity instrumentation in areas that we see are hotspots. So the two layered together, the high fidelity in situ sensing with the satellite sensing, creates a much better, broader picture for our customers than was originally viable, just leveraging one or the other.
All
And
right,
then you
that's
also asked for an example of something that maybe didn't go well. So I'll leave the name out of this one, but one is that something that I think is important when I'm asked about what founders should think about before partnering with a large corporate. And I'm a little bit fox watching, the hen house, right? Because I had two startups previously, and I'm an entrepreneur myself. Is that when you're working with a large corporate, it's important to understand the perspective of that large corporate and the people that you're partnering with. And so typically what you'll see a large corporate interested in doing is leveraging its existing channels and reach to scale different new technologies to market, while the startup then goes and looks for additional interesting and unique applications and continues to develop out the business, versus the opposite. And I've been in a few instances where the startup has this expectation that they'll continue to develop out the core business, and the large company will be the one to take on those niche applications, whereas it's quite the opposite. So just that kind of understanding is something that's important when you're working with a large company.
Are a lot of these startups, are they more like computer programming technology driven? Our audience is a lot of engineers. How do the engineers fit into a startup from your experience?
So the technologies that we work with, there's a very broad spectrum. And I would say, for example, uh, anything along the lines of anything from treatment. So we've worked with startup companies that are doing, for example, algae-based wastewater treatment, where you're using different strains of algae to capture nitrogen and phosphorus, and then you could potentially capture that, upcycle it into fertilizer that gets sold and creates a new value stream with agricultural customers. So you've got treatment technologies. You've also got novel new sensors where that are sensing pathogens or sensing PFAS as an example. That's a big topic of emerging contaminants that has been in the news and being regulated quite severely over the last several years. And now it's ubiquitous, and we know that it's ubiquitous in all of our water sources. Not to use scare tactics, but and then all the way up to artificial intelligence. So there are different types of AI applications and just an endless number of them that I'm seeing come through of AI applications that we can use in the water sector, including educating and acting as a training tool for field service professionals that are out in the field to help support them as they are out and working on our water infrastructure. And so where engineers fit into that is Xylem Innovation Labs is a central corporate innovation and venture group, but we work hand in hand with all of the engineers and R&D folks across the entire organization to help evaluate these tools and then potentially scale them up again through our channels.
How often do you come across like engineers leading a startup? Because I think a lot of people get into engineering as, they want to be an
Yeah.
engineer, work for an engineering firm, and don't really
Mhm.
consider a startup option. Do you come across that often, or is that as rare as I might think it is?
We very often see founders that are spinning out their PhD or postdoctoral work into a startup company. So that is pretty typical to see an engineer or very technical person that is leading a startup and maybe the original entrepreneur, developer of the technology, and then they become the CEO. I also oftentimes see engineers that are leading as the CTOs of the company, and then sometimes see maybe an engineer and technology developer that started out as the CEO. And at a certain point, once you've found your product market fit and once you're starting to scale into the market, then that CEO might take on the CTO role and bring somebody that has maybe some broader business experience come in and take over as the CEO. So there's really every different formulation. There's no right or wrong.
All right, great. So since we do have an expert in venture capital and startups, I thought we'd keep going on this just a little bit more.
No,
So do
that's
you have
totally
any,
fine.
perhaps any advice for, you're mostly going to be talking to engineers, so perhaps any advice for them that are considering the startup, non-traditional engineering firm path and things that they can do better or right or wrong that would turn people off?
What I most often say is that you need to make sure, so I'm thinking with my construction hat on back to, my original construction days, is you need to make sure that you have a solid foundation. And the foundation in the instance of a startup is that you are solving a real world problem that is an actual pain point for enough people and that they're willing to pay for it. And typically those pain points fall into one of a few categories. There's either crisis driven innovation where there's some sort of crisis in the world, like COVID or like PFAS, that gets people to adopt different innovations that help alleviate some of those challenges. There's also regulatory driven innovation where you have regulators come in, like the EPA, and say, all right, well, you've got to hit these minimum thresholds or you have to hit X% of water reuse. So that regulation is really a great driver as well, especially in the municipal space. And then you've got value-driven innovation. So where you're going to add additional value or save costs. And so what I typically say to founders is you need to make sure that you're solving a real enough problem with a large enough market that people are willing to pay for. And if you start there, then the rest isn't a cakewalk by any means or any stretch of the imagination. But what's not great is to spend your life and your resources and your time on something that is just interesting for the sake of being interesting, because engineers are very smart people, they're very creative, but then you'll find that there's not a market for it. And that is not how a lot of people want to be spending their time and energy.
All right, that's great. I think it's going to be very useful to a select part of our audience that's thinking about going to these things. But since you're a Xylem, let's talk about water in general. So a lot of the difficulties now related to climate change are very much dealing with water, like the droughts, floods, hurricanes. And how can Xylem and water technology in general help in these areas? And do you have any specific examples of how it can work?
Absolutely. So I think I touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the conversation, but climate change is a big category. And the statistics that I've seen is that around 80 to 90% of climate change is experienced by having too much water or too little water. And yet, water is very seldomly talked about as fundamentally part and parcel of climate change. So I'm trying to do everything that I can, and my colleagues are across the rest of Xylem and many other folks across the water industry to come together to try to figure out how can we tell our story better and how can we become part of the broader conversation around climate change? Because I think the around 3% of investment that goes towards climate related technologies are focused on water. And yet, like I said, 80 to 90% of climate change is experienced as an issue related to water. So with that as the kind of foundation on the drought side, or where you've got too little water, there are a number of technologies there to address. Big category is water reuse, and so thinking about how do you take water that's already being used and how do you filter it and how do you purify it so that you don't just discharge it back into the environment, but you actually get more juice from the squeeze, if you will, and are able to reuse that water over and over again. There's also leak detection technologies. Xylem has a number of leak detection technologies in its portfolio. So I'm thinking about either using satellite sensing to see and pinpoint where there are leaks, or Xylem's got a portfolio within its Pure Technologies business that is able to send pigs through the water system and be able to pinpoint again where there are leaks and how they should get and be able to repair them. In some cases, in some countries, there's something called non-revenue water, or NRW, which is indicative of how much water gets lost in the system. So from the point where you extract water, or where you are, taking your water from the main water source and then transporting it to another location, a lot of countries experience 20 to 50% water loss. So for every 100 gallons that's going through that system at the starting point, 20 to 50 of it just disappears. And that is a shame, and it is a waste of our resources. So the more that we can detect and fix leaks and reduce that number, the better off we are in areas where there's drought. And I'd say one additional thing is thinking about decentralization. So not all areas of the world have centralized water systems where water then gets distributed to people and communities. So there are more technologies that are coming out that allow those decentralized communities or remote communities to create their own water source. And so whether that's atmospheric water generation technology, so taking water out of the air, or whether it is solar powered desalination, so using solar energy to desalinate water for water use, there's more and more technologies that are enabling people and communities to generate their own water. So that's on the drought side.
So why do you
I
think
could
it's
get
such a
it. Yeah.
disconnect between that 3% to 80%? And what are some of the things that you're working on to try and match the problem with the concern?
It's a good question. I think that's a multifaceted answer that would take us much longer than this podcast to be able to fully address. But in terms of the disconnect there, I think some of it has to do with the value based on water. A lot of pricing of water in many countries is severely and significantly undervalued. And as a result of that, there is not enough investment back into water infrastructure and water systems. It also, frankly, doesn't get people and the community and the culture to prioritize and to value water. And so then you, again, don't see that investment further down the line. I also think that the way that we communicate about water is not where it should be. So it's not that it's not important, it's that the placing of value on it culturally and societally is not there. And I've got a personal example of that when I was in the US and then I moved out to Israel. I was very much used to US based water pricing. I moved out to Israel where there's tiered pricing, which is becoming more popularized in certain areas of the United States. And the first water bill I got was astronomical. And to the point, and this is a little embarrassing, to the point that the Jerusalem municipality sent out a repair person because they thought that I must have some egregious leak in the system to have that much water being used. But it was really, I was not paying attention to my water use. And this is maybe 15 years ago at this point. I very quickly rectified that, but I saw my water bill. It was huge. I was in the third tier of pricing. And so once I noted that, I changed my practices very quickly and my water use went down.
It seems like that would be the simplest way to try and remedy some of these problems. What's the resistance to doing that?
Well, there's also the other side of things in terms of having water equity and water access for everybody. And so water is also a fundamental human right. And so you don't want to price people out of being able to afford that fundamental resource that everyone needs. And so there is a balance there in terms of how things are priced. And again, that's why I said it would take more than just this podcast conversation to get to the crux of the issue. But there are lots of arguments to be made and lots of improvements that we can make.
If you got time, I'd like to cover just one last kind of question on water resource
Absolutely.
recovery. Perhaps some of the ways that Xylem is working with utilities to recover more water from the system that previously was just, allowed to, go to waste out into the ocean or whatever.
Resource recovery is an area that I think we're going to be looking at more and more. And I think this goes exactly back to what we were just talking about in terms of having the correct pricing around water and the cultural consideration around it, that it really is a resource and not just for water in and of itself, but once you've used the water and perhaps reuse the water again, then you now have wastewater that's been generated either by utilities or through industrial processes or through agriculture. And that now wastewater is a very rich resource and rich source of other things like high value minerals and metals and other types of nutrients. And so if we think differently, we can look at wastewater as a place that things like lithium can be mined from, or things like phosphorus and nitrogen, like I was mentioning before. So we are looking at various different types of technologies that would enable us to leverage water as a actual resource to mine critical minerals, and then again, create an additional value stream. So I think that's going to be more and more important as we move forward. There's entire bodies of research, for example, looking at the brine generated from desalination and seeing how we can upcycle that brine into something viable, useful, creating value societally and otherwise. And I sit on the advisory council of the National Alliance for Water Innovation, which is a US DOE funded initiative to do just that. So there's a lot going on there.
All right, Sivan, I think that was great. You covered some great topics, and I learned a lot from this. Before we go, is there anything you feel like you missed, particularly perhaps from your individual expertise in venture or innovation labs that our engineering audience really should know about?
I think fundamentally, I mean, we really need to think about climate change and water change being one and the same. They really are one and the same, and it requires an all hands on deck type of approach where all stakeholder groups, the public, consulting firms, startup companies, large companies like Xylem, end users of water all need to work together collectively in order to not only elevate the conversation, but elevate the investment and the time and intention and importance around water. Because at the end of the day, it's the one limited resource that we have that we fundamentally cannot live without. So let's all work together on that.